I want to talk about the ongoing fallout from the federal election. A couple of weeks ago now, but my goodness, what an election it was. The polls did not predict it. Wrong for the first time in Australia's federal election history. The analysts did not predict it really at all. The betting markets did not predict it. In fact, Sportsbet paid out a couple of days before the election on their certainty that a shortened Labor government would win, and of course ended up looking very silly indeed, and no doubt losing a heck of a lot of money. But on that federal election, I want to point this out now that the commentary has been rolling for a little while. And that is this: several Christian groups campaigned very hard in this election, like we've never campaigned before, on religious freedom and related social issues. None of these issues got serious airtime or significant mentions during the election campaign, with the exception of just a couple of sound bites from the Prime Minister and maybe a little bit here and a little bit there, but it was never, ever a serious consideration from the media or indeed part of the headline messaging of either major party. And yet all of these issues are being talked about now, despite the best efforts of some of them to sideline them. They're being called in the post-election commentary sleeper issues. That is, things that impacted the results in key seats which were not part of the headline campaign messaging at all. Why? How is that possible? Well, very simple. Faith communities were one of the groups that made a difference to the result. Not all of them, but one of the groups that made a difference to the result. And that was not only by the votes of their own members, but, and I can testify to this because we were part of this effort, it was also because, perhaps more critically, their campaign activities into the community made a difference. Do you know ACL actually campaigned in 3 of the 4 decider seats, I call them. These are the 4 seats that were declared in the days following the election night, which cemented the coalition's majority and their position in government. They were Chisholm, Bass in Tasmania, Boothby in South Australia, Chisholm being Victoria, and also Wentworth in Sydney. Now, of course, Wentworth went from Kerryn Phelps to Dave Sharma, the Independent, back to Liberal. We didn't campaign there, but in the other 3, we were active on the ground. And Chisholm in particular, in eastern suburbs of Melbourne, that was considered a seat which Labor would gain. And yet, against the odds, and despite some difficulties and some controversy on the ground there, it did not go to Labor. In fact, Gladys Liu won that seat. And this was the story right across the board. Post-election analysis shows that these seats where there are faith communities and where these sleeper issues were taken directly to the people through letterboxes, through door knocks and through phone calls, these seats had communities where hard swings towards the coalition were recorded. We could look, for example, down in Tasmania. Now, as a whole, the state of Tasmania swung to the coalition away from Labor. But the entirety of that swing can be attributed to the 2 seats in the north, Braddon and Bass. What is it about Braddon and Bass that's different to the rest of the state? Well, actually, people don't often know this, but Tasmania is the least religious state, or the least Christian state in Australia. And Braddon and Bass, however, are the part of Tasmania where most of the religious communities exist. One of the reasons, one of them, not all of it, but one of the reasons why there was a change recorded in those seats. Or you could turn to Western Australia and you say, well, what happened in WA? Well, ACL was actually active in the seat of Canning, which is the seat of the government MP, Andrew Hastie. Many of you might know of him. Andrew Hastie recorded the largest swing towards him of any Liberal member in the whole state. Now, what is it about Canning? Not only that there was the campaign there, but also Canning, south of Perth, is an area where there is a very large and a rapidly growing Christian community. And newspapers in Western Australia have since reported on the fact that the campaign to those people and the activation of those people was crucial to the result there. Or we could turn, of course, to Queensland. Obviously, Queensland, a bit patriotic here for it's my home state, but obviously Queensland had the Adani factor in the rural areas. But there were big swings in Brisbane. Big swings in the southeast corner, big swings in seats where Adani wasn't such a big issue. But you know something, Queensland is the most Christian state in Australia. Brisbane is the most Christian capital city in Australia. Do you know there are seats there? John Black, the demographer and former politician, notes that of the 25 seats in the country with the most activated religious voters, he calls them, 15 of those seats exist in Queensland. Seats like Longman and Herbert, both seats which went from Labor to Liberal. Seats in the Brisbane metropolitan area that have huge numbers of Pentecostals like Bonner and Bowman in the eastern suburbs. Both big swings towards the coalition. Or another seat that's highly religious and activated, Dixon, just north of Brisbane, Peter Dutton's seat. And everybody predicted that Peter Dutton would lose his seat, and he didn't. He got a swing towards him. And then we turn to Western Sydney, not the most Christian part of the country, but definitely the most religious. And Labor members there have been sounding the alarm to say the reason we had massive swings against us, and they were massive, in this part of the world is because of concerns about religious freedom. And this is what they're saying. You go to the Labor side of politics, and the impact has been felt. Chris Bowen, Shadow Treasurer, member for McMahon, the heart of Western Sydney. When he was asked what policy it was that lost them the election, he says, I think it was not actually any particular policy as such. I think it is a general impression which has built up as a result of various debates, including marriage equality, but also religious freedom more generally. It is a very urgent problem for us to tackle, partly by the way we look at policy, but partly by our general demeanour. It's essential that Labor welcome social conservatives in its parliamentary ranks so the party could appeal to suburban voters. The Labor Party has a strong tradition of people who are socially conservative but economically progressive, and we have got to make sure that tradition continues to be represented both in our party and our voters. Look, I would say this, that's been changing. For some years now, those in the Labor Party who have more socially conservative views have been on the way out. You look at recent resignations like Senator Jacinta Collins or Senator Stephen Conroy, or if you look at Senator Joe Bullock a little while ago, there's a lot of these guys who are quietly making their exit because they simply don't feel welcome anymore. So Chris Bowen identifies something there. New South Wales Senator Christina Keneally, she also said we lost them, that is the seats that they lost, on the more traditional touchstone culture and social issues. I think it's because we were tone deaf. If you take the issue of religious freedom, I see a growing concern among people of faith. The Israel-Folau matter, which was frankly a contract issue, spoke to a broader concern people had, and understandably so, that in expressing their faith, they are going to be howled down by other people in the community. The extent to which Labor hasn't been seen to be standing up for people of faith did hurt us. Michelle Rowland, Greenway, Western Sydney. Again, Labor had a very real perception problem from some religious people during the campaign. I definitely detected there was a different sense during the campaign. I rarely had religion raised as an issue in the 3 years prior, but doing phone calls and the type of engagement you do during the campaign, it was certainly markedly different. There was a perception of a problem, and for some people that was very real. Anthony Byrne, the electorate of Holt in Victoria, he says, we're creating a perception that for some people of Christian and other faiths that the Labor Party doesn't have a place for them on the table, doesn't want to hear their views, doesn't want to take their beliefs into account. I think that caused us substantial damage during the election campaign. I could go on. You could look at Shane Newman, for example, member for Blair up in Queensland. A stunning swing against him. That's the area around Ipswich, west of Brisbane. He was the Shadow Minister for Immigration, and he was really concerned about this, and he said things about it. Or the fact that it's reported that Labor MPs have attacked the former leader Bill Shorten over his criticism of Mr Morrison in the final week of the election campaign for not explicitly stating that he did not believe that gay people would go to hell. They described that tactic as a very poorly timed intervention that made it look as though we were persecuting people, particularly Christians and their beliefs. And indeed, I can't disagree with that. You see, Middle Australia, the communities that swung this election, not just faith communities, but more economically vulnerable, quiet Australians, Middle Australians, people who are getting on with their business, who are fundamentally, this is their characteristic, politically disengaged. They don't know many politicians, but they definitely know Israel Folau. And so the Israel Folau issue, there is no doubt in my mind, brought this issue of political correctness and opposition to religion, and particularly opposition to Christian faith, home to a lot of people who otherwise are not especially engaged with that issue, because they all know who this guy is, even though they probably don't know any politicians other than the Prime Minister, if you're lucky. And it was the same with safe schools, right? That brought it home to a touch point that the average Australian felt, their children. And this time it brought it home to a touch point they felt, which was the issue of their sport. A man who they looked up to, who their children heroise, Israel Folau, the greatest Super Rugby try scorer of all time. The new opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, has now urged the party to speak to more people of faith who no longer feel that progressive politics cares about them. Do you know, this has been coming for some time. The honest truth is that the gap between the two parties has been widening over recent years. It used to be that Labor and Liberal essentially had the same moral, social framework in sort of a Christian foundation. That used to be the case. In fact, Labor was long a party of Catholics, and before that it was established by Methodists. And so it's been that way for ages, but they had economic differences. Like you could say, let's put it very crudely and say, well, it was the capitalists versus the trade unionists. You know, there's two different economic philosophies taking place, to simplify it a great deal. But in recent years, particularly the last 10 or so, there's been a shifting, and the shifting has been a new social moral framework that is working out in the social issues and social policy base of the parties, and Labor has changed their tack, and they're moving away from the Christian foundation. I think even some of those MPs who I quoted are actually acknowledging that there's people of those traditional values who no longer feel like they belong in the party, even as members. That change has happened in a way that has meant that the electorate hasn't really caught up for a long time. So people who are politically disengaged haven't noticed what's going on. They haven't really thought this through. They've continued to vote Labor like their parents did before them, like they always have. But now you have seats in Western Sydney. No voting Western Sydney. 75% against the same-sex marriage law in some parts. Or if you go to outer southeastern Melbourne, these are migrant communities, these are middle Australian communities, these are quiet Australians. As these people start to catch up with the social change, all of a sudden you have Labor heartland areas that are very uncomfortable. And that's really what's been going on here. And in order to turn the Titanic around and come back from that social drift is going to be no small thing. But Labor, at least some, have taken some notice. But the government's also taking notice, and this is good too. Attorney General Christian Porter has promised that one of the first acts of a Morrison government will be to introduce a Religious Discrimination Act. And he said this, he said, there was enormous concern in religious Australia. From schools to churches to groups anyway involved in organised religion, they were concerned, and we saw it become a key issue during the election. And Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, a Liberal senator from New South Wales, said it's a new dawn for religious freedom. Well, we asked this question, where to now? Certainly we're seeing a movement in the right direction. Certainly the fact that people of faith got on their feet and did things is a good thing and has seen fruit in these early days post-election. But there's two big things we need to bear in mind. Firstly, actions speak louder than words. We need to hold the ALP to account for what they are now saying. There are many in the ALP who are ideologically committed to a pathway that is opposed to religious freedom and a social framework that is almost a totalising ideology that has no room for key tenets of the Christian faith. Here's the question, are they simply going to be happy to stop? Are they going to be happy to recalibrate, reorientate? That's a big ask. It's a big ask, particularly if you're in politics, believing sincerely that is a moral crusade that is good and right and one that you should pursue with all your vigour. We wait and see. Likewise though, and I don't want to lay all this at the ALP's feet, there's plenty of people, they just don't have enough power at the moment really, within the coalition who also would spurn religious freedom and indeed would elevate other things at the expense of key aspects of the Christian faith and at the expense of key opportunities for Christians to evangelise and spread the gospel. They too need to sit up and hear the warning. So we have to wait for action. We cannot sit down and assume that the job is done. No way. Here's the second problem though for, this one is just for the ALP actually, and that is that they have a national platform. The national platform has only just been drafted and ratified at the end of last year, and that platform is valid for 2 years until they have another national conference and an opportunity to change it. And that platform really does cement a policy agenda that is the very policy agenda that concerned middle quiet Australians and concerned faith communities and is frankly opposed to religious freedom. And by that, all I really mean is it's quite opposed to the flourishing of the gospel through Christian communities. It puts holds and bars legally on that being able to take place. And there was it's a 310-page document, and I've done a little tally here. There's 19 mentions of sexual orientation, 55 of intersex, 46 of LGBT, 35 of transgender, 30 of bisexual, 29 of lesbian, 28 of gay, along with several mentions of transphobia, biphobia, homophobia. Gender gets 148 mentions, 20 mentions of gender identity, 8 mentions of gender pay gap. This already adds up to over 400 mentions of something related to the realm of SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity. But then you take an issue like cost of living, which Labor's famous for, 5 mentions. Take an issue like religious freedom, you're flat out, you need a magnifying glass to find it. There is something entrenched in their policy framework which pushes a line which is at odds with the religious freedom framework. You can look at key policies of theirs that are expressed through those words throughout the whole thing, and a simple reading of it shows you what their problem is. So here's the upshot of all of that. We can't stop praying and we can't stop acting. Much prayer and much action went into this election campaign, and that made a huge difference. And firstly, continue to pray. Pray for leaders and all who are in high positions, says Paul to Timothy in 1 Timothy 2:1. How are we doing with that? And one of the huge things that impressed me was that in the lead up to the election, we put out prayer guides. I mean, tens of thousands of these things in just the first round. And the phone was ringing hot with people wanting more and more and more. And we kept running out as we tried to keep up with demand for people who were praying for this election. And Scott Morrison took to the podium after all those, nobody predicted this, and he said, I've always believed in miracles. And I agree, because I think the prayers of God's people made a huge difference this time, because people were concerned and they prayed. Let's not let up in prayer. But secondly, there was action. Secondly, I saw Christians across the country taking seriously the mandate given by Christ himself to be salt and to be light in this world. Why do I raise those metaphors? Well, salt, what does it do? It has a preserving influence when Christians be Christian, when we are who we ought to be in Christ and we do what we ought to do in this community. What do we do? Well, actually, it prevents the rot. When all things are turning to custard, when the meat is rotting, when Christians do what they do, it staves that off. It staves off the decline. And if religious freedom was at stake, if the gospel itself was being pushed into the margins and Christian testimony and witness was being clamped down on, that's a rot. That's a change that we can prevent by being salt, and I saw that happen. It's our job to prevent that from happening. But also the light. When the light shines, it pushes back darkness. And by shutting down that religious freedom, actually, that would have quenched again parts of the gospel itself. You think of Christian school communities unable to testify to the truth of the gospel because they'd be sued for it if those policies came through with the school freedom stuff. You think of parents, Christian parents, with these flabbily worded, uncertain conversion therapy laws that would simply have put them on the hook straight away if they wanted to raise their kids according to their moral and religious values, particularly around sexual orientation, gender identity issues. Think of hate speech laws that snare churchmen and clergy and all this who are doing their job before God to tell the truth. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about. And so when the darkness starts to encroach on those things, we shine the light in the other direction. And I saw people do that because they got on their feet. They shone light into a darkening place, and they were salt in an area that was seeing decay. And so through prayer and through being salt and light, great things were achieved, obviously because God is sovereign and because God acted. And God uses human agency as much as he does divine miracles of his own accord. And I think both things happened. So let's keep going. And there's a great job that lies before us, a great job. We can't let up because in order to protect religious freedom properly, we need to see what I call 5 pillars of religious freedom enacted. We need freedom of association. That allows schools and associations and other entities to continue to be Christian and testify to a Christian ethos. Freedom of speech. It allows people like Israel Folau to proclaim scripture, or people like Archbishop Julian Porteous in Tasmania to write Christian messages and not get caught up in legal process for doing that. Freedom for parents to be able to say they want to raise their kids according to their religious faith and their moral values, to get them out of safe schools, to be able to not have the government come sniffing around when they have a transgender kid and they're trying to do the best by that child, but the government thinks they should do something differently. We need freedom of conscience. That means that, people who cannot, we shouldn't be forced to violate our conscience by law, whether it's referring a woman to receive an abortion for doctors and those egregious laws that exist around the place, or whether or not it's, people who are in, say, the wedding business, like videographers. If they can't in good conscience participate in an event, why force them? They are currently forced by law. Or indeed freedom from discrimination. That's 5 things: speech, association, parents, conscience, and discrimination. And one of those things, one of 5 is promised by the existing government. And so we have a lot of work to do to make sure that one gets through, but not only that one gets through, but some of these other things are also protected in law. Because when we say religious freedom, and I want to be very clear about this, at the end of the day, the interest we have is in freedom for the gospel and the truth itself. And that is something that all people everywhere might come to a knowledge of the truth, as Paul says, that is intrinsically Christian and which is essential in our time and our day. And if you want to participate in a campaign to petition this Parliament to enact freedoms for all of those things, I encourage you strongly, go to acl.org.au, because we have just released and launched our religious freedom campaign, and it is available there for you to sign and to get on that train, because there's an awful lot more action to come over the next few years to see that we use this window of opportunity that's been divinely opened for us, that we might walk through it and continue to push for the truth and for religious freedom in this nation.